Welcome. Welcome, everybody. It's Michael Fox, the WSR project manager and regional consultation coordinator. We're doing a Webequie Supply Road information session specifically for Neskantaga First Nations community. And my co-host here is Don Parkinson. And as well as we have Ange Brooks from SNC to help us with some of the more technical questions if they come up. We are doing a range or a round of consultation all this summer, April to August. Our first round of consultation as part of the EA approval terms and conditions from the Ontario Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks. They asked to ensure that there's at least 3 touch points, I guess, for each of the 22 communities that we have to consult with. So this is round 1. We have 22 weeks we set certain time to offer the first round, and we're very open and flexible and adaptable for any other sessions that communities want. Either on the phone, the old school way where we used to fax things and, adults, 1 fax, 1 phone, 1 presentation, very simple. And we can walk through the presentation to virtual, all the virtual options that everybody's using today and are still using during COVID. As well as face-to-face, whether in community or outside the community. We've done a whole range of stuff, and we offer that range of stuff for Indigenous communities related to this project. So we invite everybody also to come to the Webequie Supply Road website, supplyroad.ca. It's full of information. It's also full of translated information. And fact sheets. We even have EA tutorials, video tutorials by subject matter experts within SNC Laval's team, and newsletters, animations. We have computer animations, etc. So it's a wealth of information, and I invite everybody to check it out for additional information. With that, I'll flip it over to Don, if you want to.
Thank you, Michael. And as Michael mentioned, this is the environmental assessment phase, round 1, set of consultation with Neskantaga, first consultation event. And what we're going to do is play a pre-recorded presentation, which will be simultaneously translated into Ojibwe. And then after that presentation, Michael and I are going to come back and talk very briefly about some of the issues raised by Neskantaga during the course of, mainly during the draft terms of reference preparation phase. And we'll discuss those briefly and then open it up to questions and comments from Neskantaga community members and or their representatives. So without further ado, if our technical team can play the round 1 presentation that describes the project, let's watch that, and then we'll come back and continue by discussing the issues. Welcome to the Webequie Supply Road Environmental Assessment Phase Round 1 presentation. Today, we are going to talk about the environmental assessment steps, what we have learned from communities, the importance of Indigenous knowledge, road route alternatives, and what happens next. For background, Webequie First Nation is about 250 kilometers from the Hudson Bay and James Bay coasts, and the road runs south of Webequie and then east to the Ring of Fire area. The purpose of the Webequie Supply Road is to move people and supplies to the Ring of Fire area, create jobs and business opportunities for community members, as well as skills training opportunities for young people. This would be done in a way that will preserve and strengthen the community's language and culture. The road will be 107 kilometers long, with 17 kilometers of the length actually within Webequie First Nation reserve lands. The corridor planning area is 2 kilometers, but the actual cleared area will be 35 meters. The road will make 3 large water crossings, one across Winisk Lake and the other 2 across rivers. And the project will also include temporary pits and quarries, equipment storage areas, and construction camps. Now we are going to talk about the environmental and impact assessment processes. There are 2 environmental assessments actually going on. There's an Ontario or provincial one and a Canada or federal one. Webequie is also doing their own internal assessment of the project. At the end, one report is created for review by Ontario and Canada. There is coordination between the federal and provincial EA processes at different points in the process. One body of documentation, though, one report, one body of documentation will be produced to address requirements of both the terms of reference, which is the provincial work plan for the EA, and what we call the tailored impact statement guidelines, which is basically the work plan from the federal side. Now we are going to talk about the communication we have had with Indigenous communities. When we were developing the work plan for the environmental assessment, also known as the terms of reference for the provincial environmental assessment process, we created a project website. We sent notices to communities, did virtual and in-person community meetings, and made project information available in many ways, such as through the website or by mail. And we've also accommodated during COVID by switching a lot of our in-person meetings to virtual meetings. We have received comments on the environmental assessment terms of reference or environmental assessment work plan from many First Nations and First Nation organizations. These comments are wide-ranging. They talk about many, many different topics. Some of the topics are focused on Aboriginal and treaty rights and interests. There's cumulative effects and the need for regional assessment. So looking at the broader effects of the project and looking at the project from a much sort of higher level in combination with other projects that are either planned or exist in the area. We heard comments on protocols, so ways of communicating with communities and the consultation process. We heard comments on environmental assessment or impact assessment, the actual undertaking of that work. And then we also received comments on participation in capacity funding, providing resources to communities so that they have the capacity to be able to review documents and conduct their own, for example, Indigenous knowledge studies. There were other comments on ownership and maintenance or operations of the road. There were comments on socioeconomic impacts of the project. There were a number of comments on climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, as well as water or water quality, and wildlife and plants had many comments as well. So there were comments from a lot of communities, a lot of First Nation organizations, and about many different subjects. Let's move now to talk a bit about the study plans. There are many studies involved in an environmental assessment. The technical team had to prepare detailed plans explaining to the federal government how these studies will be done. So these are very detailed sort of recipes as to how the work will be undertaken at a very technical level, and these were reviewed by the federal government. by experts in the federal government. So there were a number of different technical study plans prepared, and the subjects include geology, terrain and soils, surface and groundwater, air quality and climate change, noise and acoustic, vegetation, wildlife, fish and fish habitat, species at risk, socioeconomics, human health, visual environment, and cumulative effects. Our team also prepared fact sheets to summarize. Now we will talk about how an environmental assessment is done. There are many steps involved in an environmental assessment. One of the steps is to identify what we call valued components. Valued components are the environmental, health, social, economic, or additional elements or conditions of the natural and human environment that may be affected by the project and are important to community members, are of concern or value to the public, Indigenous peoples, federal, provincial authorities, and interested party. They are what people are concerned about. Then we have indicators. Indicators represent the resource, feature, or issue related to a valued component. So what's important to community members. And if these indicators are changed, they may demonstrate an effect on the environment. A better way probably to describe them is a way of measuring potential effects. And it's used in the assessment and evaluation of alternative routes and the overall effects of the project. Now let's talk a bit about assessment boundaries. For each thing that community members think is important to study in an environmental assessment, a valued component, a study area needs to be defined. These are different depending on the valued component, and that's a very important thing to remember. So there are three general study areas. What we call the project area or project footprint. Then we have 1 kilometer on either side of the road center, which is called the local study area, and the regional study area, which is 5 kilometers on each side of the center line of the road. Those are the general study areas. And this next map shows the three basic types of study areas relative to the two alternatives, the community-based alternative and the technically preferred alternative, which looks at the community-based alternative and makes minor changes to the route based on better terrain and soils and other factors. Let's now talk about the study areas for valued components more specifically. The study areas for valued components, or things that are important to community members, are determined by many different things, including what community members are saying, Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous land and resource use, and Aboriginal and treaty rights. Now we're going to move to talk a little bit about baseline studies. Think of baseline studies as a way of finding out the way things are now, so what we call existing conditions. And if we know that, we have something to compare to when looking at possible impacts of the project. So it's a snapshot, a picture of the way things are before the project. There are many studies that are done as part of an environmental assessment. These studies look at three general areas: the natural, or what we call biophysical, socioeconomic, and cultural. They're all under these categories. For example, let's look at natural or biophysical. Within that, we would have studies on vegetation, such as the peatlands or wetlands and forests, wildlife, fish and fish habitat, species at risk, air quality and climate change, noise and vibration, visual environment, surface water, groundwater, and geology, terrain, and soils. So there are many studies on the natural or biophysical in the natural or biophysical category. Now, if we look at the socioeconomic infrastructure and social services, then we might look at human health. Might look at land and resource use, or indigenous knowledge and land and resource use. Then we look at another major category of studies, which is archaeological resources or built heritage or cultural heritage landscapes. So there are many groups of studies, and even within the studies that I mentioned, there are more studies that are done, more specific studies. For example, if we were to look at caribou, there are a number of different types of caribou studies that are done as part of an environmental assessment or an impact assessment. Let's now look at select valued components as examples. And this will hopefully help everyone sort of better understand what I've just been talking about. So let's look at study areas for wildlife. The general or local study area would be a 1 kilometer buffer, as I mentioned before, from the center line of the alternatives, 500 kilometers from what we call supportive infrastructure. So these are things other than the road that are required as part of the construction or operation of the project. These might be camps or aggregate or rock source areas or access roads. And then the regional study area, general regional study area, extends 5 kilometers on either side of the local study area boundaries. If we look at moose, for example, that has a different local study area. In that case, it's 10 kilometers from the center line of the alternatives, 500 meters from supportive infrastructure, but the regional study area extends 50 kilometers from either side of the local study area boundaries. Then we look at caribou. Caribou have an 11-kilometer buffer from the center line of the two alternatives, and from the same distance from supportive infrastructure camps. So it has a bigger distance around it to define the local study area. And then the regional study area for caribou includes entire ranges of caribou, which is these are very, very large areas. Next, and finally for wildlife, let's look at Wolverine. Wolverine has an 11-kilometer buffer from the center line of the alternatives and from the supportive infrastructure, and it extends 50 kilometers from either side of the local study area boundaries. Let's have a look now what that means in terms of maps. So these next few maps will illustrate the different types of study areas I just discussed. So this first one is the general study areas that I was talking about. The next slide shows the different local and regional study areas for moose. And then after that, we have the wildlife study areas for wolverine. So as you can tell, you can see the 50-kilometer buffer around there, much larger area. And then finally, the largest study area you can see here, you can see the local study area on the actual map, and then the regional study area, which includes 2 ranges for caribou, and that is in the upper right corner. So it's a much larger area. So let's talk a little bit about wildlife again, and some of the criteria or valued components associated with wildlife, just to give you an idea of and a better understanding through examples. So for wildlife, you might have forest birds, you might have raptors, you might have shorebirds or waterfowl, or bog and fen birds like muskeg birds and other wetland birds. You might have bats or fur-bearing animals, like lynx or rabbits, ungulates, which are moose, for example, amphibians and reptiles, and then pollinating insects as well. So the indicators or the ways of measuring those could be, for example, changes to habitat availability, the quantity of habitat available. Is that impacted by the road? Could be changes to abundance, meaning actual numbers, or the distribution, the spatial distribution, where these animals are over the land or water. Could be changes in the species richness. And we talk about that, we mean the diversity of species, the number of different species. Could be changes to survival and reproduction. Could be changes to predator access, habitat use, and population. Or it could be changes in wildlife mortality or due to stress from. So let's talk a little bit about the baseline studies for birds. Spring and fall aerial water bird surveys were conducted in 2019 and 2020. And some of the things that we found were that the large lakes, and this isn't that surprising, were staging areas for waterfowl. Smaller lakes and rivers aren't really used that much by migrating waterfowl. We also conducted breeding bird surveys in 2020 and 2021. And we did listening counts at 263 stations. And we also used things called acoustic recording units at many different locations, actually 89 different locations, to listen to the sounds in these areas. The next slide shows some pictures that were taken from our breeding bird survey fieldwork. We also conducted baseline studies on bats to look basically for how many species are present. So we looked at, as I mentioned, bat diversity or number of species, and we used listening devices, what we call ultrasonic recorders. And we did surveys at 10 different locations. We found 5 species of bat, including the little brown bat, which is endangered in Ontario. We conducted a number of baseline studies on caribou as well. Caribou aerial surveys were conducted in 2018, 2019, and 2021. These are aerial surveys where we have biologists looking down and counting the number of caribou and identifying male, female, and making other observations about other large mammals. We also conducted in 2020 a caribou calving study, both by foot and by helicopter. We conducted a caribou collaring study in 2021, and that helped us identify calving areas where community members, where caribou would have their young, winter areas, and identify travel corridors by being able to track the individual caribou across the landscape. And so far, the data has shown that most collared caribou are of what we call the eastern migratory population that winters in wooded areas, but actually has their young along the Hudson Bay shoreline. Next are a few pictures of some of our caribou aerial surveys. And then the slide after that shows photos from our collaring study as well. So let's talk a little bit next about baseline studies for wolverine and amphibians. We conducted, starting in 2021, a wolverine occupancy study. And so we set up sampling stations called run poles that at 25 different sites within 10 kilometers of the planned road center line. And then these stations were set up to include what we call snag posts to collect hair from the animals that would visit. And then there were wildlife cameras set up. From this work, not only did we get a boundary of Wolverine in Ontario, and we've gotten some really interesting results from that. We also did some amphibian studies where we sampled for calling frogs by using these acoustic recording units that we had set up for breeding bird studies. And this allowed for evening surveys to be done in these remote muskeg or wetland areas that we wouldn't be able to get access to otherwise. So next, let's move on to talk a little bit about Indigenous knowledge. A big part of an environmental assessment is Indigenous knowledge. We have, with the Webequie Supply Road project, an Indigenous knowledge program. We need communities to share their Indigenous knowledge with the technical team to help us identify potential project effects. This helps us avoid or reduce potential effects on Indigenous rights and interests. As part of doing this work, we take the Indigenous knowledge that we are able to collect. We make sure that it is kept confidential to whatever degree the community would like us to. And then we combine this information with the Western science information to very comprehensively identify impacts of the project. We want to work together with your community to collect important Indigenous knowledge. As I mentioned, we will respect the need for confidentiality. We have communicated with communities about the need to collect Indigenous knowledge for the project, and we've also invited communities to participate in our Indigenous knowledge program. So again, this is a very, very important part of this environmental and impact assessment, collecting Indigenous knowledge. And we really would like to encourage communities to provide that input to us so we can make sure that we've assessed impacts of the project very, very thoroughly. Let's move now to talk a bit about consideration and evaluation of alternatives. We have different route alternatives that have been developed by working with community members. Of the two alternatives, one is what we call the community preferred route, and the other is based on where the best land for road building is. So it's sort of the technically preferred route. We're also looking at different locations for sources of road building material, such as gravel and rock. This next map shows the two alternatives. In yellow is the community preferred route, which was derived by Webequie First Nation members meeting over a fairly long period of time to discuss the best possible route for the road. And then the green line represents technically preferred version of that route, looking at the best areas to travel through in terms of best terrain to build in generally, and other factors as well. Each alternative does get evaluated in detail, and there are many factors involved in that evaluation, such as natural environment, Indigenous knowledge, land and resource use and interests, socioeconomic and cultural heritage, and of course the technical side, cost, constructability, and safety. And the purpose of the evaluation of these routes and aggregate or rock sources is to identify a preferred route and preferred locations for sources for aggregate and rock that has the least potential for bad effects, for negative effects, and the greatest opportunity for controlling those negative or bad effects, and offers the community the greatest benefit as well. The evaluation of alternatives also considers other facilities that are part of building the road, such as temporary access roads to get to those gravel pits and quarries, for example, to get to the laydown and storage yards, construction camps, as well as bridges. Let's talk a little bit about consultation approach and next steps. We will be talking to communities in the next few months. We have 3 rounds of consultation planned as part of the environmental assessment phase of the project. This presentation is for round 1. But as you can see in this slide, we have the 2 other rounds, round 2 coming up hopefully in fall of 2022, and in winter or spring of 2023, the final round, round 3. This round talks about the overall IA process. It talks about the IK program. It talks about criteria and indicators, the evaluation of alternatives. The next round, round 2, will summarize the input that we got, identify alternatives, identify preferred routes for the road and aggregate or rock source areas, and provide some preliminary engineering design elements. And then finally, round 3 will be a summary of round 2, what we found in round 2, and a summary of preliminary effects, early effects based on our analysis of the project, and proposed ways of managing project impacts or mitigating impacts, limiting or controlling impacts, and then talking about follow-up monitoring, either during construction or post-construction. We will be collecting your feedback on the project in many ways, including community meetings, interviews, open houses, live streaming sessions, the project website, and social media. There are many different ways available to collect feedback from your community, and we welcome input from you in terms of how you would like to communicate with us. In terms of next steps, let me just talk about where we are here now. We are looking for input to finalize the criteria and indicators, as well as identify study areas for the valued components. We're looking to continue with our baseline studies and collect Indigenous knowledge. Now, in fall of 2022, we're looking for input to evaluation of alternatives and selection of the preferred route and locations for the construction material sources, aggregate and rock. And we'll be doing the preliminary engineering design of the road. Then, in winter of 2023, we'll be getting input to preliminary effects, assessment of the project, and input to proposed impact management, mitigation, and follow-up monitoring. And then finally, in the summer and fall of 2023, there would be a review of the draft and final environmental assessment report or impact statement, the document that goes to both the provincial and federal governments. We want to hear from you. Please provide us with your comments through the project website, which is supplyroad.ca. Speak with the project team after the presentation. Fill out a feedback form. We have contact information on the screen for you. We welcome your input. We will respond to you, and it will make the environmental assessment and impact assessment better with your input. Thank you for joining us today. Miigwech, and we will see you soon. Okay, we're back. And now Michael and I are going to talk briefly about some of the issues that have been raised by Neskantaga to this point. And Mike, I've got, let me just start right from the top here. One of them is, which we've heard a number of times, is the need for a cumulative effects assessment undertaken with full First Nations involvement, meaning, I believe, all the communities in the region. Another one we got was on ownership, operation, and access to the road. And we've gotten that one a number of times, haven't we, Mike?
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I'm just trying to get organized here.
And that one is one that really, those discussions really haven't kicked off to any great degree, have they, Mike?
Well, on the first one, the cumulative effects, so we are doing cumulative effects assessment, not just for this road, but other roads, and so in effect, there'll be 3 cumulative effects assessment that will be done in total, maybe even more, with a potential regional assessment, which is yet to be defined. Exactly what they're going to be studying up and above what we're studying already. But for the ownership, was it the ownership?
Yeah, ownership, operation, and access of the road.
So this is the Webequie supply road we're talking about here. So the Webequie supply road was the economic development road. that they envision for themselves that starts at their on reserve at their airport, and then move off the reserve 17 kilometers out to 107 kilometers to the proposed mine site and exploration activities. So they were envisioning an economic development road to help facilitate the movement of goods and people and supplies, to facilitate, I guess, economic development opportunities for themselves, using their airport as a little mini hub for warehousing and for fuel depot and all that kind of stuff. So that's where the idea came from. So in terms of who ultimately will be owning the road or operating the road, that's still in discussion. Part of it, especially with Webequie Supply Road, is that part of it, 17 kilometers of it's on reserve. So either, they have a few options, in terms of on reserve facilities, because that's basically what it'll be. And they're exploring those opportunities for the on reserve portion, and then having, sort of dialogue with exploring and having dialogue on the model, I guess, once it gets off reserve to the proposed endpoint. So it's still open-ended. For the people that never done this before, you sort of need to understand the lay of the land, so to speak, literally, and all the sort of getting the geoscience and the bioscience in place to understand what type of road, what the specifications of those roads, how many crossings, what type of crossings, etc., to get a sort of an understanding of the full picture of the proposed footprint, and then working sort of from there to understand, okay, well, what's the total cost of this? What's the total impact? What's the total benefit? And then from there, the communities can, Webequie can make a decision whether they want to proceed or not. I mean, the chief, Cornelius Wabass, as well as the project management team within Webequie, they'll tell you their primary reason for doing this Webequie Supply Road is to generate the information needed to make an informed decision. I'll say that again. The reason why they're doing this is to generate the information needed on the baseline and the effects assessment, so that they can make an informed decision whether or not the benefit outweighs the impacts, especially the Webequie Supply Road, because it's right in their homelands, on reserve and off reserve kind of thing. So so the ownership model is still being considered. What kind of models are out there? I mean, we met with the First Nations proponent, or the Indigenous proponent in Northwest Territories, with that road that they built, the two communities, and how they financed it, how they funded, and how they operate that road. So we're looking at different models, I guess, across Canada when it comes to the ownership and the operations on this. And what really determines that is actually the specifications of the road. So part of that, as you know, Don, is we sort of got this geogrid model. That's sort of atypical of roads in Canada. I mean, there are geogrid models out there in terms of this kind of floating road concept. So allows the water to still continue to flow. But the actual ownership model that's what we're kind of exploring. We got lots of time. A couple of years, 3 years before ministerial approvals and community approvals are done.
Yeah, another one, Mike, is that the community mentioned was the need, in their view, of more detailed archaeological studies where potential aggregate sources are located on or near eskers because of the significance of the eskers for many reasons. So that was one that was brought up by the community, and understandable as well too, because those eskers are significant. I know in our search for aggregate material, there is not a significant amount of aggregate material in the sense of gravel that's readily available, and the eskers are quite sandy. So there's, in that scenario, you're looking more at quarrying kind of situations, and a couple of locations have been identified, but that's still being finalized as well. Another issue raised is estimated capital cost of the road, and that's still being refined. It's being refined as more information is being collected. There was a high level estimate that was done initially, and I think we're gathering more information. We're better able to sort of define that. But again, we can't get that down to a number that, we can say is reasonably accurate until we get more information, right? And then look at all the information that we collect as part of the EA, and you were talking about the use of GeoGrid, and all of that has cost implications. Additional culverts have cost implications. So until we have a clearer picture of what is required in different areas, we can't really refine it too much more.
No, I think this is Neskantaga session. I mean, they were part of a 4 First Nations preliminary study. It was over 500 pages in that study, and it kind of looked at preliminary costing of another road scenario that all 4 communities were part of. That included Webequie, Neskantaga, and Nabinimik and Moncton. And in that sort of preliminary study, and we had a center line, like we had a corridor with a center line, and sort of defined by all the 9 options that we looked at, but in that study, it actually looked at poor soil, fair soil, and good soil. Yep. And we have good soil, the cost is cheaper, but when you have poor soil, the cost per kilometer is higher, just because by virtue of the terrain, on a per kilometer basis. So very insightful document for the Neskantaga folks that are listening or will be listening to this, is to look at that report, and you'll get a pretty good idea, based on the Canadian Shield and the Hudson Bay lowlands, the terrain, and some idea how this may unfold for the Webequie Supply Road. So the Webequie Supply Road, at this point in time, we're at preliminary engineering design. So I would underline preliminary, and until we get into detail design, that will be the point where we'll get better estimations on costs.
Another one, Mike, that's been brought up is the impact on trap lines as well too. And there are Neskantaga trap lines that run close to, I believe, the project study area. So that's another one that the community identified. And related to that, sorry, Mike, did you want to go ahead?
No, because it was one value component, right, that we looked at. A value component within the Indigenous knowledge value component. Yeah, if we can remember, because in finding alternatives, there's a reason why the initial part of the road is like a spaghetti, because we're avoiding Indigenous sites of cultural significance, or ceremonial sites or sacred sites, or so the ultimate corridor, sort of the corridor that we looked at, and then the alternatives within that corridor was largely shaped by Indigenous knowledge, and trap lines were one of the value components within that trap line. So it's not typical, when a company comes in, it's puts a footprint down, and then IK or Indigenous knowledge is an afterthought, or it becomes mainstream. It was actually this Webequie Supply Road by Webequie members, the land users and the knowledge keepers that were part of shaping the actual routing, determine the corridors that we were looking at, kind of thing. So,
and those discussions occurred over a number of years with a wide cross section of Webequie community members, didn't they, Mike?
It was the same thing. Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's in this remote region. It's just part of the practice. Indigenous proponents see looking at roads, and Mushkegowuk's doing it on their James Bay feasibility study for their road. So it's done for winter roads as well. You engage the community around routing or changing routings. So in this case, Webequie, because it started on the reserve, and there's trap lines on reserve, as everybody knows, and then because Webequie's reserve is so it's big, it's a large land mass, and then once we got off, again, there was discussions mainly with the line users of from Webequie about the ultimate routing.
Another one, Mike, that was identified by the community is the shared territory. Neskantaga and Webequie share territory in the project area too, the overlap there.
Yeah, so we I think I really haven't seen a map yet of land utilization patterns from Neskantaga. I seen, I think, something more on the west side, when we're looking at there was some map I saw when I was in Neskantaga when we were doing the east-west, right? So it didn't extend all the way up to the east side or the reserve boundaries of Webequie. So I've yet to see what kind of land utilization patterns or sites of cultural significance as it relates to the Webequie Supply Road. And it's a discussion again, Chief and Council and the project management team within Webequie is going to have.
Exactly. We would like to talk to the community about that for sure. The final issue I have here too, Mike, is commitments tracking and compliance enforcement, and that's obviously something that evolves the development of the commitments and over time as the EA matures, and then that gets coupled with the compliance enforcement as well too. So obviously the follow-up basically from the project, it's really important, and Webequie has those same strong feelings about ensuring that commitments are met and enforced as well too, right, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, again, the project manager team members would tell you, this is members from Webequie that sit on the project management team. They will tell you the primary reason they're doing this is because it's their homelands that they worry about most. I mean, they still get their protein off the land and off the lakes and rivers in the area, and their primary consideration is to make sure that there's no major impacts on their way of life. And looking at a dirt road, to the proposed endpoint is something top of mind for them. They know they know their area. They're not saying they know all of Northern Ontario. They know their area. They're inputting that area to make sure that just like they shape the routing of the road, because that routing of the road was actually not the it was more of a north-south, if you remember, like that was the better road technically.
Yeah.
And but there was a sacred mount there, among other things, fishing, I think it was, and we're just going to go there. And so we changed. So and that's how this whole project has been guided by the principles of Indigenous principles of Webequie First Nations.
So with that, Mike, why don't we open it up to questions and comments from Lo or Laura, if they have any?
I'll go ahead. Sorry, Lo, I think that questions have actually been submitted. I don't know if there's any of those particularly that you'd prefer to address, but I can also just read some off if that's easiest.
Yeah, sure, you go ahead, Laura. Thanks.
Okay, so Let me just consider which one I'd like to start with here. Well, I guess like just a broad, easy to answer question is that will the discussion of the truck and other road traffic, will that be measured in like a quantitative or a qualitative way? And how will that be shared with the community?
Yeah, so the road traffic is, sort of any traffic count or study is an estimation, I guess. In this case, the Webequie Supply Road as a discrete project, it's going to be pretty light traffic count, and I'll be part of the overall EAIA report. So it's an isolated road, as a Webequie Supply Road at this point in time.
But it is a quantitative estimate, and that's used in the for design considerations.
Yeah.
Okay, I've got another one here. Just sort of you sort of touched on this before, but so you talked a little bit about the cumulative assessment and also the regional assessment, but I wonder, will a full life cycle assessment of the carbon emissions that are associated with the mine and the roads and the traffic that will be on those roads are higher than the direct emissions at the site? So will the estimates be provided of the cumulative GHG emissions like within the reasonably foreseeable future activities that the project might facilitate by providing this infrastructure? Just given the concern to sort of like the overall overarching like climate impacts, like how will the cumulatively the GHG emissions be considered both at the mine and with?
So unfortunately, Laura, we don't have the full suite of experts on this call today, but we did obviously we did receive your questions, and we're going to respond to them. Some we can hopefully today, but we're going to have to there's a lot of different disciplines that are required and to be drawn upon to respond to these questions. So we will respond to these as many as we can. Well, we will respond to all of them, but only some of them we can really respond to, I think, in this session.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess, well, two questions then. I'll pass it on to Lo after this. But so the first question I have is like when or how could we anticipate these questions being, like the answers to these questions being shared? You'll send it via email or put it on the site, or?
Well, we'll send it by email for sure. Timelines, I would say probably a couple of weeks. I would say, Laura, just because of the logistics of coordinating everything with all the different disciplines involved. For
sure. I have a question. I'll pass it on to Lo after this, but it's just not one of the ones that we had listed. And you talk about the Indigenous Knowledge program, which I think is great. I wonder in what ways are you? I've just been a part of a few other assessments where there's sort of some, I guess like maybe like a lack of confidence in how the knowledge is being collected, and then also the transparency in how that knowledge will be shared. So how will communities know who's been consulted in the sort of intake of this knowledge, and how will that knowledge be shared both with the proponents and also within the assessment and shared back to the community about how that is being integrated? Thank you.
No, that's a good question, Laura. And I would invite you to read the Indigenous Knowledge guidance documents that the federal agency has. So from a proponent point of view, we set out sort of the parameters of the IK program. And in this case, the provincial government's providing funding to the participant funding program that they have. And in that in that funding program, there's three buckets. You know, there's the TOR review, the EA, and IK. So how communities divide up that resources to address each of those four buckets is really their prerogative. Like, and if they do it themselves or through a tribal council, or they hire a consultant to help facilitate to produce an IK report for the proponents to receive, and then so that becomes, you know, what we receive on that end, which is most likely the case for most of the communities that are involved in IK out there for the WSR. They'll do it through the consultants that they hired already. I can confirm there are consultants hired on some of these other communities that are doing their IK program. So when you look at the guidance from the federal agency, the interim guidance for IK, they were very explicit that not only is it integrated in the report, but we have to go back and do a validation process, you know, with the community if they want it. Most probably will do an uptake of that validation process, but yeah, so that is something new under the Federal Impact Assessment Act that wasn't there before.
Right. Yeah, there's been a lot of changes with the new act. I guess also, so you had one of our questions sort of addressed that Neskantaga is sort of, you know, knowledge shouldn't have to be validated when it comes from the community, but by this validation, just for clarity, do you mean like that the community will be able to have the opportunity to say, like, this is collectively what we sort of like a consensus of the knowledge, or it's not validating the knowledge as science? Or can you just
just that what they received and how it was integrated in the report is there, you know, within the report. Like, it wasn't like redacted in a way that it reduces the value of what they provided.
Okay, that makes sense to me. Thank you so much. Lo, if you have any questions, I'll pass it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. Those were some great questions. Let me see. I'm just looking because we had sent quite a few questions, so I'm trying to focus which ones might be in your scope for today, Don and Michael. Let me see. Yeah, I was just curious, when you're sort of going over in the presentation, so how you're doing wildlife baseline studies, like what factors are used to measure habitat availability? Or like, is that the quality of the habitat that's available? Yeah, can you talk about is it just because there's a road or a quarry, that's what's unavailable, or is there a range of an area that might be impacted by noise and that would make it unavailable?
Ange, do you want to answer that one for us?
Yes, sure. I'm just trying to get the video working. Okay, so your question is about habitat availability and how we measure that. That is measured. It's quite complicated. We do it with a statistical model, and we do it with, how do I explain this? Basically measuring, if you've heard of ecological land classification. So we're taking the vegetation units and classifying them, and then we take what's known. Let's use birds for an example. So if we look at olive-sided flycatcher and the habitat that flycatcher uses, we can measure the amount of vegetation units that are within, let's say, the local study area. And we take the number of flycatchers that were recorded during point counts, and then also the number of flycatchers that were detected in all of the acoustic recording units within those habitat types. And our statistician takes all of that information and puts it into a model, of which I am not really familiar with because not a statistician. And that's how we get that information. So it's fairly complicated, and we need a lot of information to be input into that model. Then the information we get back, which comes back kind of complicated, and then we distill it down and put that information into the EA in a form that's easily readable by the average person. So we just make it as less technical as we possibly can so that it's understandable. Does that make sense?
Well, I understand. I understand that it's something that's complex, and that I appreciate that you're turning your mind towards translating it, I guess, into a less technical language. I guess it would just be helpful to get a sense of the study in non-technical language sort of earlier in the process. And that could be something that, I think these questions are going to be answered in writing. So
yeah, exactly. So we can answer that. Yes.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and Lo, we can provide the study plans as well too, Ange.
We could, yes.
Yeah,
exactly.
which I think would help you, Lo. Because again, Ange is giving one example, and it's, but I mean, there are other examples that we can, that could be provided, but it's probably easier just to get the study plan from us and go through that.
Yeah, I see Laura saying in the chat that would be great, and I definitely agree.
If you go to the webequie and look under studies, you'll see the study plan summaries, and you'll see both the summary of the plan and the actual study plans for all the biophysical disciplines.
Yeah, the full versions are on there now, right, Mike? That's great. Okay.
Great. I do have maybe one or a few more questions. I'm curious at the beginning, just because like two of the three purposes of the project, right, sort of is about jobs and economic development and training for youth. And I was wondering if you had more information to share about that. Are we speaking about jobs for construction of this road? Are we speaking more about long-term effects for other possible developments? And just if you have more information about that. Thanks.
Well, Mike, did you want to address that? We are going to do a deeper dive into that area, aren't we, on this project?
Yeah, we're planning to engage with construction workers of roads and operators of maintenance for roads to see what the roster of occupations are for the maintenance of similar roads. So there'll be the construction opportunities, and then the operating and maintenance of it. And then, you look not too far west from Webequie, like there's what do you call it, North Road, north of Pickle. And, and what they do, the parts of the road the communities take on to maintain and operate. I actually know the guy who does the grader. So he has a contract with that 5-year contract. He was able to finance a grader for himself and start up his own business to maintain the road. So again, and then there's the environmental aspects of it, whether monitors and the like around and if there's aggregates operations maybe up and above what Webequie is currently doing. I don't know if you guys know this, Laura, know that most remote communities need aggregates to maintain their airstrip. And seeking aggregates, so that, there's a certain standard that airstrip has to be maintained at. Otherwise, any airline that lands on that airstrip that's substandard can lose their license to operate from Transport Canada. So that road is maintained by Northern Development Mines remote airport division to ensure that those airstrips are maintained to standard. And what's required there is aggregates. And aggregates for a lot of the remote communities are getting further away. And it's costing more and more money because the further it goes, the further. So aggregate operations is something that Webequie currently does. So there might be an expansion there for aggregate related jobs.
Okay, so it sounds like, sort of to paraphrase, these are road construction jobs for the life cycle of construction of this road, and sort of whatever opportunities may arrive. I was going to say down the road.
So we don't know. Yeah. So until if there's more exploration camps that come up along the road, yeah, of course there'll be camp-based related jobs that help facilitate that. Where right now it's you're sort of stuck with air travel and contingent on helicopters or planes, float planes operating. But if there's a road and if it triggers more further exploration along the road, yes, that will facilitate jobs.
And Lo, part of what Michael was talking about, where we would sit down with construction companies to identify the types of jobs that might be involved in the construction and maintenance. Further to that, we would identify maybe skill set requirements, right? And certifications required. So there's a certain amount of community readiness that is assessed as part of this work to ensure that the communities hopefully have workers available with the proper certifications so that they can participate to the greatest degree possible in the project.
And so what would happen, say, if there weren't a lot of prepared workers in a community when it came time to build?
Well, we hope that situation doesn't present itself, but
it's like with housing, right? With rapid housing and stuff like that. In Webequie, they haven't built houses. I think it was 10 years prior to the last 3-4 years, where they actually essentially build a new subdivision. And so the folks that used to know how to build houses, at least INAC issued houses, were kind of overwhelmed, especially the number of houses that they had to build. So they had to actually bring in contractors to help finish the schedule because of the seasonality. It's not like you have 9 months. You only got a very short season where you got to do the prep and the wires and pipes, all that infrastructure, and then build the houses. So with the roads too, I mean, there are winter road operators. In fact, a lot of them helped us in siting the road because they're very familiar with the landscape. They have heavy equipment there. I think they just bought two new equipment, if I can remember. James, the First Nations project manager in Webequie, I think he said he just financed 2 new equipment. So part of it's equipment operator, right? Like in terms of the job, they'll be leasing those equipment to any projects nearby. And in the event that they need more, well, they may import some maybe from other communities that are looking at job opportunities or contract opportunities. It's not it's no secret that the Metallo communities that are all pro mining, pro roads, like already on roads, they're seeking opportunities to partner, and they're bringing kind of almost, I would say, predetermined partners to the table, to the Metallo region. They signed with the PCL and they signed with a few others. I mean, this is public. You just Google them. And you wonder where are they, why are they building these relationships? Well, it's no secret that they want a piece of the action. You know, in the event that Webequie needs workers, there'll be probably Metallo workers, you know, community workers coming.
Right, it just seems like that would be an opportunity for that training aspect of the purpose of the project to come in, sort of rather than bringing in.
Yeah. I mean, there's again, it's a roster, and each roster, timing's everything sometimes. You know, like KNET or KCAT's Metallo's own training facility, right? Like they trained a lot of people thinking that somehow the Ring of Fire was going to be accelerated. You know, the regional framework was going, let's get people trained up, we're going to get whatever. And, when they got their Common Core training, you actually have to be on site somewhere within a year, or you lose that ticket. If you didn't register that ticket based on a job site, then you have to retake that training. I know this, my brother did. And he had 1 year to actually find a job based on his train on as Common Core to register his training, his certificates. He had 1 year to do it. Unfortunately, he went to Timmins. He was ambitious enough. So there'll be that type of training. There'll be trades training, and there'll be operating trainings. In fact, one of our subcontractors, Origin, which is an Indigenous-owned company, his whole mandate is to train people on virtual training, virtual orientation, virtual site visits. Welcome you good folks online here or on load to see what he does, because that's his whole thing's Indigenous and getting people trained up, especially with the equipment and this evolution that happened in other sectors. My real dad used to be a lumberjack, sawing that thing, up in the Timmins area, and then mechanized the sector with filibunchers and skidders, and so it was a lot of workforce gone, and then you needed heavy equipment operators. Same thing with mining. They went through a process, and then they went deeper underground. Now they're into robotics. They're so deep now that that's too hot. It's too hot for human beings. It's too expensive to put ventilation down that deep. Now they're into robotics. So Origins, as an Indigenous led, is keeping on this trend, and he's actually training people up for these future jobs that might be out there. When it lands, in my lifetime, in 20 years, 30 years, I'll be in a rocking chair somewhere watching everybody remote control and the EV cars, and I don't trust it. Yeah, there'll be a different training. Some training will be a line of, it's simple, just like my son, Latte Power. I got twin boys, and my twin took advantage of the training Latte Power, the First Nations owned transmission line in the remote regions of Ontario, and there was a line of sight to the job, and he got a job right away. He's actually constructing transmission lines up north of Sir Lookout. It's the same thing. Certain jobs will be a line of sight right away. The guaranteed job after certain training. Certain trades they're going to have to put their hours in before they're journeyman or red sealed, whatever that's called. Kind of thing. So yeah, it's different. I've worked on big projects, and it's not an easy undertaking. It sounds easy, training, jobs, whatever. No, it's effort.
Sure, thank you. Laura, I saw that you had your hand up, and just looking at the clock, and if you did have another question, you should jump in and go for it.
Yeah, I realized it's not really relevant, so I took my hand down, but thank you. It was, yeah, I'll leave it for now, but thanks, Lo.
Thanks.
I enjoy it. I mean, I enjoy conversations. Illuminating.
Here's something that I had that didn't quite come up in the presentation. I'm wondering about plans for remediating the aggregate quarries. Have those been built into the EA? Have they been built into cost benefit? sort of, how is that aspect being dealt with?
Remediating?
So temporary quarries, Mike, that were used for the construction purposes, not permanent ones. And you may know more about this, but I mean, there's a legal requirement for those to be remediated, isn't there?
Yes, correct. There is a requirement for under the Aggregate Resources Act, a pit or quarry must be rehabilitated once the pit or quarry is no longer being used. And in fact, who's ever getting a permit down the road has to submit a restoration plan before they get the permit.
Yeah, there's a separate permitting process for either temporary or permanent quarries and pits, isn't there?
Yep, there is.
Thank you. I completely forgot about that. Good question. We actually had Webequie, what's that association? Ontario Aggregate something association, but they do workshops on business plans, the business of aggregates. So we bought 3 Webequie members to that a 2 or 3 day workshop that they offered just before COVID. So they get a sense of what an aggregate operation is. It's not easy. I actually got a deeper appreciation of aggregates. My dad worked for MTO and sand the highways and make things safe and all that kind of stuff. So I just looked at it as a pile of dirt. That's not the case. Like, it's so specific. There's actually a lot of science behind aggregates, a lot more than I thought. And so you just reminded me, Ange, with that question that there's it sounds like mining, like you need a closure plan, right? But in this case, the restoration plan.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
So it sounds like, correct me if I'm misunderstanding, that the plan for that closure, the permit holder at the time of submitting that permit, that's when those plans will be detailed, and it's not being included in the environmental assessment. Is that correct?
So so there's been possible sources of aggregates that's been identified. Geotechnical work has to be done to see if I guess, what do you call it, the quality or the amount is there.
Yeah, the size of the deposit.
Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, so it's a separate permitting process. So there's the, I suppose you could call it, the overall permit associated with the EA, and then subsequent to that there are many other permits. One of which is or a number of which are related to aggregates after that, where the plan would have to be submitted, the remediation plan would have to be submitted.
yeah. So that's provincial land, and then there's Indigenous Service Canada for aggregates on reserve, any aggregate operations on reserve for Webequie. So there's a different process there that they have to go through, which is not as, I want to say, you're just dealing with the different bureaucracy, because I know, because I have regulatory roadmap for both. I had to map that out for Webequie, that they're 2 separate processes. So if the viable project's on reserve, and then so that's a different process. It all depends on where Webequie goes with that too. If they created their own land code under the First Nations Land Management Act, they don't need the ministerial approval, because the whole point is to develop their own land regime based on the land codes that they have, and then they approve their own land use. So there are I think 20 something communities in Ontario that adopted their own land code, so they don't have to ask permission from the minister how do we use their own reserve. So there's options there for Webequie in managing, I guess, the process if they want to enhance it. If they think Indigenous Service Canada's process is deficient, and then they want to make sure, because it's their homelands on reserve, that it's boosted, so that enhanced, so that any effects are mitigated if not avoided. Yeah, so it's a steep learning curve on both ends, both the federal process on reserve and the provincial.
Sure. And just maybe if we can squeeze in one question in the last couple of minutes. I'm just curious if the EA and impact assessment processes are considering wildfire and like, I think we're hearing a lot of science coming out about the sort of increased risk to wildfire that's occurring as a result of climate change. So how is the environmental assessment sort of incorporating that risk? Changes to that risk level?
I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, I think that must be captured in the climate change work, but I don't know offhand.
I'm just wondering if it's more operations. You know, because I remember working with First Nations, working on transmission lines, and with those poles and wires, they were very concerned about fire, and especially in far north Ontario. You guys can look this up. I mean, the M&R had sort of let it burn policy, I guess. That's what it's called, I guess. Or that's let it burn. I mean, I don't think they call it that, but that's what everybody refers it to. So the regulators of Ontario have a large role when it comes to the fire. So it is something. I just assume it was in operations, but we can get back. We'll get back to you on that. And
Yeah,
you're
we'll
right.
look into that. We'll look into that for sure.
Thank you. That would be really helpful. Well, I see we might not have enough time to keep going, and you've got all our questions in writing, so I'm happy to leave it there unless Laura, you wanted to ask anything else.
No, I think that's yeah, lots to think about for upcoming sessions, but I appreciate the time that you gave us for questions and comments today. Thank you. And we
Are
look
you-
forward to those written answers so we can share
Yeah.
them. Too.
So you guys, if you don't mind me, you guys like graduate students or?
I'm a PhD student. Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
I look at mostly mining and also the dew line for anybody who.
Oh yeah, I know what that
Yeah.
is. I'm from
Yeah.
Winnisk. I know, so I
Oh,
know.
there you go.
um,
Yeah. Most people are like, I don't.
oh yeah, you're probably gonna get reactivated, the dew line.
I know. Yeah, exactly. Timely.
I'm always open to learning more what people are studying. So I'm a nerd by nature. I'm doing my doctorate in business administration as well. Slow, but I get a chance at. But I'm also looking for workers. So after you wrap up, whatever, let me know.
Also slow on this end here. Just so much to do. But yeah, thank you so much for today.
Sure, anytime.
Yeah,
Seriously, email me.
I'll
anytime.
echo. Sorry, I was just going to echo that. Yeah, thank you so much for your time. And
Thank you, Lo.
I'm at the law school. I'm in the JD program. Just
Oh yeah.
I got a lawyer too on staff, so I mean you can I'm talking to you after.
great.
Thanks, Lo. Thanks, Laura.
Thank you. Take
Thank
care.
you.
Take care.